Prior to 1921, we had been using the cannabis plant for thousands of years for the variety of uses that it has for us, as livestock feed, as medicine, as a source of paper, as a textile. So it used to make rope and fabric and things like this. So it was somewhat important to us. It, via one means or another, probably entered our diets in one shape or form. Since it would have been growing wild in most places and would have been fed to cattle. But it was called hemp back then because there was no differentiation prior to 1921 between the female seed producing variety of cannabis sativa and the male, what we now call the hemp plant, either the inert non-seed producing version of the plant. Both plants would have been growing wild throughout Europe, North America, the East, and so on, and would have been in use by us for thousands of years. We used cannabis in medicine. Throughout the 19th century, cannabis was available in pharmacies. It is in fact the number one painkiller. Is the number one painkilling medication, and had this medicinal property since antiquity. That's been used alongside, oh, by the way, opium you can buy in pharmacies, and that those two were sort of our ancient staples of pain-killing remedies. I have an old medical textbook from the 19th century, and it talks about opium. It discusses opium. It discusses the possibility of opium dependence and so on and so forth. And it says that yes, this is like what you should use in case of moderate to severe pain. It should be used for X amount of time and no longer, really, because it may cause dependence of this, that, and the other. And I think it also acknowledged in that book that some people choose to use it recreationally, or some people abuse it recreationally. And that's obviously to be discouraged. However, it neglected to mention cannabis, because I think on a level that's a bit like, a modern day, like, it wasn't quite, it was like, this was like a textbook for a family doctor, if you know what I mean. And cannabis was the number one over-the-counter medication. So it's almost like they don't really need to know that so much. It was more about, they don't, that'd be a little condescending. It'd be like, it was a family medicine textbook. Domestic medicine is what it's called. But, that's what everyone knows about by then. It's the number one over-the-counter painkiller. Just for things like headaches and very small aches and pains and whatnot, one would use cannabis. People also smoked cannabis mixed with tobacco, actually to make tobacco go further, and to cut tobacco with it. I understand that was a tradition in pipe smoking going back at least to the 16th century, when tobacco was first, well, I suppose tobacco was introduced in the late 15th century, wasn't it, into Europe, and I think I'm right on that. And or it was usually smoked with cannabis. It was usually smoked with hemp. So like tobacco was bizarrely enough like the drug, because cannabis back then wouldn't really have got you high quite as much as it does now, or not like with the newer, very potent with a high THC content strains of cannabis that you have today. It wouldn't have been quite like that. The THC levels would have been much lower. It wouldn't have been all that bad for you to smoke it. In fact, it's far healthier, I think, to smoke probably quite a lot of weak cannabis with tobacco, if you must smoke tobacco at all. I think, that's probably a lot better for you. And probably less likely to lead to things like lung cancer if you augment your tobacco smoking with cannabis usage. And we have an endocannabinoid system in our bodies as well. And really we've evolved with cannabis. We have records of cannabis use in our cultures dating back thousands of years. I think the earliest recorded cultivation of the hemp plant goes back to 4,000 years. But then again, like we need to treat archaeology with a bit of a pinch of salt as well, since the oldest plough we've ever found is from 1600 BC, 1600 BC. So I mean, we know that we were using ploughs before then. Surely, we know that ploughing and cultivation across that way was older than that. I think by other means, but that's the oldest plough we found, if you know what I mean. So I think really our history, so far as it pertains to our use of cannabis, probably goes back to like when we were apes, and well, we are still apes, but when we were whatever sort of ape species we've evolved from, I reckon we were probably using cannabis as kind of like roughage in our diets, just a source of vegetation. Like we've been using various roots and tubers and fruit also, and small animals as well, and eventually sort of hunting animals, and eventually discovering fire and cooking animals and things. And but we didn't get rid of vegetables exactly from our diet, did we? So we sort of gathered stuff, and lots of times the animal meats we have been hunting in our environment we turned into stews and whatnot, and also then eventually raising livestock and feeding them hemp more than likely constantly, and either milking them, and like the THC would go into the milk. In fact, like the lives we live now, like probably like not very healthy because we lack cannabis in our diets. And our animals are kind of overstretched, overburdened because they lack cannabis in their diets. And there's all sorts of oils and nutrients in the seeds particularly, and that's what we really need. We need like low grade weak cannabis. Weak cannabis to feed to livestock and things because of what's in the seeds and the oils and essential fatty acids and things of this nature, nutrients, and it'll give it to dairy cattle, for instance. I imagine it greatly improve things like foot problems and joint problems and all this sort of stuff, and that's another benefit of using it. And I think it's no accident that we only made it illegal after the introduction of the internal combustion engine, because it tried to do exactly the same thing with alcohol. It turns out that you can use alcohol in internal combustion engines, and you can dilute, if you want to, the petrol or diesel you're burning in an internal combustion engine with alcohol to a ratio to like 95% to 5%, as like 5% petrol diesel to 95% alcohol. You can run an internal combustion engine on that. So, of course, we all know from GCSE chemistry, as I know from GCSE chemistry, and that's what Prohibition was probably about, really, I think, is that sphere, the oil industry, that sphere of American economics dictating things. And yet, the same way with cannabis, we can derive renewable, sustainable biofuel from the cannabis plant, from the oils bound up in the seeds of it. Like you produce the cannabis plant that grows to maturation, it emits all this oil, doesn't it? And this THC and crystals of THC, if you want, and the ones that are selectively bred for that purpose. And you can selectively breed for another purpose, produce high CBD oil producing cannabis plants with lower levels of THC, and all the oil can be turned into plastic or fuel. And this was gleaned at some point by American oil companies who'd struck it lucky out in the desert and found places where oil just flows out of the ground, where crude oil flows out of the ground. And in an effort to monopolize the oil market and make the biggest bucks possible from doing something relatively easy, like sticking a pipe in the ground, versus at the time, something relatively difficult, like cultivating a huge cannabis crop and then turning it all into fuel. Like at the time, it made sense to eliminate the competition. And at the time, also, like, cannabis was just a painkiller. It was basically in everything, and then it just sort of weirdly disappeared from stuff. And then it was replaced with paracetamol, ibuprofen, and aspirin as the major painkillers ultimately. And everyone was just like, yeah. And then you could probably get opium and things in pharmacies for a little while longer. No, that all kind of went away. And I think, yeah, the restrictions on opiates and cocaine, which you also used to be able to get from pharmacies, those came in. And the recreational drug use of opiates and cocaine, which was going on in any case, of course, like, loads of medicines and things contained cocaine back then anyway. And was it really so bad? Those times, like in the cocaine days of the early 20th century, because like, World War One was brought on probably by a desire of Britain, the United States, and France to annex the trademarks for morphine and heroin. Morphine being one of the central opiates in opium, along with codeine. You probably still get codeine in pharmacies. You can still get codeine in pharmacies now, frankly. Yeah. And they isolated morphine, and they turned it into diacetyl morphine, which is heroin. And we were trying to get hold of the trademarks for that, because that was then being sold in pharmacies. And it's not that we didn't want it being sold in pharmacies because we wanted to make more money from it selling to hospitals directly, and not having what could otherwise be a very good price for it undercut by having a high street retail market for it. In the process of doing so, obviously, also, we ended up pricing about 80% of the world's population out of the market for morphine and heroin. And diacetylmorphine, which is used in operations, it's used in surgeries, anesthesia. So yeah, we ended up pricing 80% of the world's population out of the market for that, and hence also Western medicine, which was absolutely wonderful of us, because at the same time in Britain, we were also progressively giving up our ailing and creaking overseas empire, which had sprawled to an inordinate extent, and we had no real way of keeping control of it all anymore, and had movements towards independence blossoming in various parts of the world, notably India. And after the First World War, fought, I would have said, yeah, unambiguously over opium, and specifically likely over international trade routes, and specifically the poppy fields of Anatolia and that trade across the Black Sea into Europe and thence to Germany, where in their enormous pharmaceutical laboratories of companies such as Merck and Bayer, and what would eventually coalesce into IG Farben under the Nazi Party, they were, distilling morphine, selling that, and they were also synthesizing diacetyl morphine at the time, and selling that very cheaply as an extraordinarily effective anesthetic and general painkiller. And we're now using the same drug basically to put people under. No more or less people die, I don't think, of drug addiction or drug overdoses if you sell heroin to adults, for goodness sake, in pharmacies. I don't think any greater or lesser share of damage it is actually done if you make it available for sale in pharmacies or not. I think likewise the same is true of cannabis. I think likewise the same is true of cocaine and all the rest of the drugs. If anything, I think if you do just liberalize it and allow it for sale over the counter to people who want to buy it, they're not going to get a dangerous version of the drug. They're going to get a very pure version of the drug, that's likely as unaddictive as it's possible to make it. It won't be entirely unaddictive. I think people are always going to get addicted to it, regardless of whether or not you make it illegal. I think if you make it legal, however, you tend to minimize the deleterious effects of a substance in the first instance, the extent to which it is addictive. You also, and you also minimize something else. You also minimize the extent to which peer pressure can operate. You also rob it of mystique. You know what I mean? It's also, if you make it legal, it's no longer an act of rebellion for the youth to take a substance. So, for instance, you find among the native Dutch population in Holland, and this has always been true, they like ordinary Dutch people, like, take cannabis less frequently than we do in Britain. And cannabis is, of course, legal in Holland in coffee shops. And like, fewer people take cannabis out there. I think there's far fewer problems, I'm just tempted to say, associated with mental health and the use of cannabis in the Netherlands as opposed to in the United Kingdom. And I just think what the feels of this specious, and it's always specious, research into this ostensible link between cannabis and psychosis. If you were to just do a translational study of Dutch people versus the British, the Dutch cannabis users versus the British, I think you'll find far lower rates of psychosis among the Dutch users and other nations in which it's now legal. I'm just tempted to say. I don't know what does tempt me to say that. But I mean, in Britain, like, really, there's a higher climate of fear and paranoia here anyway. I think because we're a more illiberal and intolerant nation than the Dutch, and you get the sense. The Netherlands is also, there's less crime there. There's less poverty. It's less unequal as a society. It's more egalitarian, more tolerant, and more liberal than Britain. They're also slightly richer on average. As a result, I think, if nothing else, taxing cannabis. Yeah, maybe just for that reason alone. Why not? They have cannabis. They have a strong tourism trade because of cannabis. A lot of money comes into the country for that reason, and they tax that. They tax that. Sensible, is it not? Why not do that? And that, with the other drugs, at least you can ensure its safety. Now let's go to a different set of examples. Let's go to examples where drug policy is very draconian, where it's very harsh, where there are big penalties imposed for dealing, supplying, possessing drugs. So in Russia, for instance, the penalties are very strict and severe for the possession of heroin. So heroin has actually fallen out of favour fallen out of favour as a drug of choice, or many people who would otherwise be heroin users, they're using far more dangerous moonshine versions of heroin. They're cooked up from over-the-counter pharmaceuticals, such as notably crocodile, which is a form of synthetic heroin, or sort of cooked up, crudely synthesized opiate or synthetic opioid. This is then injected into the skin and causes the ossification or calcification of arteries and causes people's skin to harden and die and turn scaly like that of a crocodile, supposedly. I'm just thinking, like, that is totally the wrong attitude. That's the exact opposite of what you want from drug policy. You don't want those things. And then in the United States also, certain states of the United States know better really than Russia in all sorts of levels, or maybe actually slightly better than that, I think. But there's huge epidemics of fentanyl and OxyContin, since these are synthetic versions of heroin that crucially can't be detected as easily by sniffer dogs, can be smuggled more effectively. But cheaper probably for dealers to buy, and that's basically the only reason it's sold. And well, that's one of the major reasons it is sold. And you've got huge problems with very dangerous drug addiction in the places where the laws are harsher. Do you see? And then there's other examples like more synthetic opioids in other very strict nations like Indonesia. You don't know what it's like in China, but I mean, I don't anyway. And then it takes on a multi-dimensional character when you it takes on like the problems with drugs become exacerbated when you apply harsher penalties for using them. And that applies to all drugs across the board, from heroin, cocaine, the big class A's we call them in the UK, or the big Schedule 1 drugs you call them in the United States, down to cannabis. Usually, though, I think if you permit and tolerate cannabis use, you'll eliminate a very great portion of the people who'd otherwise go on to abuse harder substances. They just get caught up in the net of stronger and stronger cannabis, and you can just use more and more cannabis, and maybe tolerate mushrooms in addition to that, and try and direct people towards more like naturally occurring substances and entheogens that have, I think, a huge potential for benefiting us greatly. I think particularly with psilocybin mushrooms, we can gain great insights into ourselves. We can greatly, augment and cure our neuroses, I think, and treat ourselves for anxiety, depression, PTSD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and all these sorts of things. I've made huge gains with my mental health through the ritual use of psilocybin. And I went to Amsterdam last year deliberately twice to use psilocybin as often as I could to try and make these gains with my mental health. And I think I did manage to do that. And I found it extraordinarily beneficial for me personally. It gave me a huge amount of clarity when it comes to my mental health and to my life and to my life purpose. And I found it greatly inspiring for creative work. It's made me far more creative, I think, and far more adept at creativity in writing and in speaking and painting and whatever else it is I do, and lots of other things I do, in business even, as I think that's a form of creativity very often. Engineering, my physics work I do in my spare time, I credit all of that very largely actually to the use of hallucinogenic substances, to psychedelic substances. I think those drugs, they really, expand the mind and have the potential to improve our lives and to allow us to be able to have the insights necessary to improve the world around us, crucially also to improve ourselves and to improve our world once we're our best self, I think, mate, or something like that, and assist us in life on that level. And I think there's a mystical, spiritual dimension to the ritual use of those substances as well, which is extraordinarily important in my life and something I'll never give up. I would never want to give up. And I would never take heroin. I would never take crudely synthesized street smack. If I were to ever consider taking a stronger opiate than the opiates I've taken in the past, I've taken opium. I've done opium tea on a few occasions. I did experiment with that. It is, after all, a naturally occurring substance. I wanted to see what it was like. It was bloody wonderful. It was, a warm, loving, joyous, very pain-free experience. Very, numbing and blissful is what it was. But I didn't feel the need to do it again after one experience with opium tea. Or I did do it again, but it was many years later. And yeah, other than that, I haven't really dabbled so much with opiates since yeah, that's a kind of yeah, it's something I didn't really want to get into ever. But yeah, cannabis has always been very beneficial for me as a kind of a way of medicating anxiety and treating PTSD, or just really for stress relief. Smoking a doobie here and there, or like after a hard day's work or a hard day of no work. Just sitting around or smoking a joint on a nice day, it's lovely. It's appreciating nature and the earth, good people. It's good. It's not what it is a far better alternative than alcohol for relieving stress, for one thing. It has no physical effect on you at all. Alcohol has a dramatic and negative effect on my body, I think. I feel it now even after one or two drinks, and I feel slightly under the weather for days on end after having drunk any amount of alcohol. And I hate it. I'm fuzzy in the head, and I feel like vaguely acidy and shitty in my stomach. I get acid stomach, and because of the effect on my body, that affects my mental health. It adds stress. Cannabis doesn't do any of that. It just relieves stress. Makes me just chilled out, happy, hungry. Notably, it does give me the munchies. And I tuck into some food and have an amazing time. Yeah. And I enjoy getting high. I think, yeah, like it helps my creativity to some extent also. I think it helps me come up with like funny little ideas quite nicely. And sometimes it helps me write poetry. It doesn't have the long-term positive impact on creativity that psilocybin does, I don't think. Nor the immediate and major creative gains that you can experience with psilocybin and other hallucinogens, such as possibly DMT also. I've taken DMT also in the form of ayahuasca. I've never taken smokable DMT. But yeah, I found really like my major insights into physics, and also I think probably comes out of ayahuasca. I think I'll probably credit DMT and ayahuasca with those sorts of insights. But then I had already taken psilocybin by then, so I don't know if I'd always have come up with it. I think probably because of psilocybin I ended up taking ayahuasca. So yeah. Like, yeah, I mean, when you're younger, I think when I was younger, alcohol wasn't such a huge problem, but it actually became a problem for me. I became dependent on alcohol, and I was destroying my body with it at one point. And yeah, fortunately now I've managed to kick, and that was an addiction. That was an addiction that was very strong, very potent at one point. But I've never been addicted to cannabis in that way. Although I do acknowledge that I do have a liking for cannabis. I probably will smoke cannabis if it's around. Just like in the same way I will, like, compared to other things like tea and coffee, I will run out of coffee at some point. I will eventually consume all my coffee. I will eventually consume all my cannabis. Then have to buy more. I don't know what to compare it to. Or tea. It's probably about as addictive as tea. It's as addictive as caffeine. Or I depend on it in a similar sort of way, I think. Like, I need caffeine to perk me up and wake me up in the morning. And like, it's really actually not negotiable. And particularly in the job I do at the moment on a dairy farm. Yeah, it's not negotiable. And cannabis was only made illegal in the first place to protect the oil industry, to protect the paper industry from William Randolph Hearst and his machinations in the United States, and to create a monopoly for the new painkillers, ibuprofen and aspirin. paracetamol, that were being introduced at roughly the same time. And the DuPont probably had a hat in the ring with nylon, new fabrics and so on to take over from hemp fabric and hemp fiber. And it's a sad and stupid and erroneous bit of history that's contributed to degradation of the environment, the pollution of our air and our water, and our seas, and the acidification of our oceans, the extinction of species, loss of habitats, everything else. It's put us in this extraordinarily dangerous geopolitical situation we're currently in, where we're scrabbling around and scrapping and fighting over the remaining natural resources that are left in the ground, and while trying to supply ever-growing societies, or societies that become addicted to growth with yet more reserves, fossil fuels and so on, such that they can continue expanding, or more energy rather, and into this banal paradox where at some point we have to acknowledge that, and not only do we need to liberalize cannabis to use its oil as a petrochemical, use it to power our vehicles, but also to use it in rotations to regenerate our soils, and so that we can cut down on our usage of nitrate fertilizer. So we can stop using as much ammonium nitrate on our soils. We can put the other macronutrients back into the soils, repair soil structure, remove pathogenic bacteria, remove pathogenic forms of fungi, so on and so forth. And thereby restore the 3 billion hectares or so of currently degraded agricultural lands that exist globally, and renewing them as carbon sinks by adding those deep tap roots and those healthy mycelial networks, those healthy fungal networks into soils, that lock up carbon in the soil. For one thing. For another thing, we could be using cannabis as building materials, which as much carbon as we ever need to sequester will be locked up forever, and we'd be able to thereby reverse the greenhouse effect, climate change. It is all possible. It is right there for the taking. All that's needed is a well-directed, conscientious, top-down approach to that problem of degraded farmland. And I think most of that land is in China, of course. The cannabis grow readily there, of course, and I think they've gotten the wrong end of the problem, or they think it's something to do with water. So they've devised its huge network of canals stretching from the south of China to the north of it, where the lion's share of this degraded farmland is. And of course, this huge network of canals, the water's evaporating before before it reaches the end of it. So it was somewhat fallacious for that reason. But I'm somewhat rambling. There is one country that serves as an excellent example of what pure totalitarian elimination of all drug taking, what it gives, right? That's North Korea. Any country like that, any country where there is just no medicine. There's no medicine. There's no morphine, heroin, cocaine, cannabis, anything for most of the people of North Korea. However, if you want to live in North Korea, a country that ostensibly doubles as a prison camp, which most certainly does, or rather networks of prison camps to be more accurate, that is one of the most brutal totalitarian regimes that we're currently aware of. Other examples might be Eritrea, where there's no infrastructure, no medicine, a brutal dictatorship, ruled by warlords. You know, these are the places where recreational drug taking is the least tolerated. The biggest crackdown, the most draconian countries are these countries. It is these countries where the advocates of drug illegality and drug criminalization would have us imitate either, the AK-47 toting warlord ruled wastes of Eritrea, or the jackboots of the Kim family's regime in North Korea. Those are drug-free societies.